The wind had long since stopped carrying her name. It whispered only dust now, slipping over the cracked earth like a tongue through dry teeth. The sun hung low, bleeding against the rim of the western hills, casting gold over the haggard form of a woman buried to her neck in the dirt. Her pale hair, like winter wheat too early harvested, caught the dying light. From a distance, she might have looked like a rock or some forgotten scarecrow, but up close, you'd see the breath barely moving her chest, the blood dried under one nostril, and the grit lodged between her lashes. No one came looking for her. No one ever did. Her name was Bessie Ray Callahan, 25 years old, wife and name only to a man who once held her hand like a preacher held a Bible. Once, she'd been called pretty. Once, her laughter had been the kind of thing men lingered near doorframes to hear. But that was before her hair turned white at 24. Before the miscarriage, before the bruises, before the day she stopped answering back. Now her only companions were the buzzards high above and a beetle crawling near her cheek, drawn to the moisture of her eye. Robert had left her here at noon. He'd told her it was symbolic, that the land needed to take the disobedience out of her bones. That the white in her hair was shame he couldn't carry anymore. That Eunice Harrow had come back to town and he was owed a new chance at life. So he dug a hole behind the old Joshua tree, stripped Bessie of her boots, her shawl, even her name, and filled the hole with dirt until only her shoulders and head remained. Then he rode off. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't look back. The sun baked her skin as hours passed. She'd gone from trembling to stillness, and now hovered in that quiet place between despair and dream. Somewhere deep, she thought she heard her mother's voice, a lullaby whispered from her childhood porch, but it might have just been wind through sagebrush. Her lips cracked when she tried to pray. It wasn't the dying that scared her. It was the idea that no one would remember she'd ever lived. Far off, the sound of hooves. She couldn't lift her head, but she listened. Her heart, weak and thready, tightened with a panic she didn't have the strength to voice. She'd learned long ago that footsteps didn't always mean safety. And men on horses, they weren't known for mercy. But this one slowed. She heard the groan of leather, the creak of a saddle, a pause. Then, boots on earth. The crunch of steps coming closer. Her breath caught. Her eyes, though dry, darted toward the sound, catching only shapes. A shadow fell over her face. For a moment, the sun was gone. Then the voice, quiet, deep, unfamiliar. "You're not dead?" Her throat was too raw to answer. She blinked once. The man dropped to one knee beside her. She saw dark skin weathered by wind, a leather vest patched from age, black hair tied back with a fraying ribbon. His hands were calloused but careful. He brushed the dirt gently from her brow. "Don't speak," he said. And he began to dig. Not fast, this wasn't a rescue bathed in light and urgency. It was slow, careful, deliberate. He used a ladle first, scooping the earth as if it were precious, then moved to his hands, pulling with his fingers when the ladle bent. The sun slipped lower, turning the sky to rust. She closed her eyes. Her body screamed as air touched skin again. She was too far gone to cry. When the last of the dirt fell from her waist and she crumpled forward, he caught her. He didn't ask her name. He didn't question why she'd been left like this. He didn't speak like a white man trying to impress God or the law. He just knelt there, holding her, until her breath came back slow and shallow. He lifted her into his arms and carried her across the dry plain. She didn't know his name, but her head rested against his chest like she'd always belonged there. They passed no one on the way. The town was tucked far enough east, where voices turned cruel after supper and women were measured by how quiet they kept. A place where a man like Robert Callahan could beat his wife and still be called decent. As they moved west, into Apache country, the wind picked up again, as if it remembered how to speak. He laid her across the back of his mule, wrapped her in a faded red blanket that smelled of wood smoke and cedar. She drifted in and out. Once she woke to him humming in a language she didn't know. Once she opened her eyes to stars she hadn't seen in years. Once she whispered something, maybe a name, maybe a plea, but he didn't ask her to repeat it. He just walked beside the mule, one hand gently touching her foot to keep her from slipping. In the town, Robert was already buying fresh linens. He'd sent word to Eunice that his marriage had ended in the eyes of heaven. She hadn't answered yet. But he shaved clean, washed his boots, and whistled while hanging a new curtain in the parlor. He didn't know Bessie was alive. Didn't know she'd been carried like something sacred through the desert. Didn't know she'd already left him behind, not by death, but by mercy that looked like a stranger's hands in dry earth. The mule climbed the last rise before the canyon. The cabin waited in the hollow below, mud walls, smoke from a chimney, a single lantern flickering in the dusk. Tomas Nali said nothing. Just kept walking. And the dust behind them slowly settled, as if covering the grave that never claimed her. The cabin sat low against the canyon wall, half swallowed by red rock and silence. It wasn't much: mud brick walls, a door that stuck in the heat, a roof patched with sod and pine slats. But it stood firm, and it had never seen cruelty. That was enough. Tomas Nali stepped off the mule before it reached the clearing, as if even his footsteps might wake the wounded thing he carried. He moved with the care of a man who knew grief well. His wife had died in the same blankets Bessie now wore, though her face had been calm, her skin unmarked. Bessie's face told a different story. She hadn't spoken since he found her. Her eyelids fluttered in half-sleep, her body limp and weightless in his arms, like a bird that forgot how to fly. But she breathed. That was something. Inside, the air smelled of juniper and iron pots left to cool. He'd left stew on the hearth before riding out. Now, as the last light bled through the small window, Tomas laid her gently onto the low cot near the fire. She didn't wake, not fully. Just shifted, as if trying to pull the blanket closer to her chest. He crouched beside her and pressed 2 fingers against the hollow of her throat. Faint but steady. "Still here," he murmured. Then he sat back, his knees creaking, and pulled a basin from the shelf. The water was cold and he warmed it with a ladle of stew broth. He wrung out a rag and began wiping the dirt from her face. He didn't ask what had happened. He already knew enough. When he'd first seen her, she hadn't looked like a person anymore. Just a pale face sunken in the dust, lips blistered, hair the color of snow even though summer clung to the hills. A cruel man's joke, he thought, burying a woman like a punishment. Not the Apache way. Not any way that spoke of honor. Her wedding ring had been snapped in 2. Not slipped off. Broken. He noticed that first. He worked in silence now, sponge sweeping over her jaw, her neck, the faint bruises on her collarbone. When he finished, he poured her a little water and lifted her head. "Drink." Her eyes blinked open at the sound, gray-blue, unfocused. For a second, she stared through him. Then she drank, barely a mouthful, and sagged back down. Her fingers curled weakly around the edge of the blanket. He stayed beside her until the fire dropped low. When he rose, he lit a lantern and stepped outside, sitting on the front stoop with a tin cup of broth. Coyotes called somewhere to the east, but they didn't come close. The mule brayed softly in the brush. Night stretched out wide and slow. He thought of his late wife then. Lena. Small, proud, full of fire even when her breath left her. She had died in that very bed. Not screaming, not afraid. Just quiet. She'd made him promise to live well. Not in noise, but in goodness. In shelter. In kindness. In keeping his hands open instead of closed. Tonight, he wondered if she'd sent this woman. Inside, Bessie woke fully for the first time. She turned her head, groaning softly. Her body ached in places she didn't recognize. Her mouth tasted of copper and soil. For a moment she forgot where she was: no dust, no sun. A fire flickered nearby, throwing long shadows on the walls. Then she saw him. Tomas. Sitting outside, backlit by moonlight, still as stone. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw. Instead, she reached for the canteen left by the bed. Her hand shook so badly she spilled half of it, but she drank anyway, and wept as it ran down her neck. She remembered the shovel scraping beside her ear. The sound of hands, not cruel, not hurried, digging her out as if she were a buried seed. She'd thought she was dreaming. But he was real. She sat up slowly, arms trembling, ribs pulling tight like they might crack. When she swung her legs over the side of the bed, they didn't reach the ground. He heard her move and stood. In the doorway, they met again, her upright but shaking, him tall and unreadable. She flinched before he could speak. He held up a hand. "No one here will hurt you." His voice was low, edged in an accent not from any town she knew, but the words were clear, warm. She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once, just enough. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Bessie." "Just Bessie?" "For now." He didn't push. "Tomas." She whispered the name once to herself, as if testing how it sat in her mouth. "Why'd you stop?" she asked. His gaze didn't move. "You were alive." That answer landed like a stone in her chest. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple. No sermon. No judgment. Just a fact. "You knew what he did?" Tomas nodded. "I've seen men like him." She looked down. Her white hair fell forward, a strand curling over her cheek. She tucked it behind her ear, embarrassed. He didn't look away. "You thought I was a ghost," she said. "When you found me." "No," he answered. "Just someone they tried to bury too early." Silence stretched, but it wasn't heavy. Just slow, like evening smoke curling from a chimney. He didn't offer her pity, only space. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. "I don't know." "You don't have to decide yet." She blinked. "And if I stay?" "I'll make more stew." That startled her. Not the kindness, but how ordinary it sounded. She expected rules, expectations, warnings. Instead, she got soup. Later, when he brought her a bowl and left it on the table, she tried to eat. Her hands shook too much to lift the spoon, so she used her fingers. It was salty, rich with beans and dried meat. She cried again, but didn't stop eating. Tomas sat outside all night. Not because he didn't trust her inside. Because he wanted her to feel the space without pressure. In the canyon, silence wasn't absence, it was safety. By morning, Bessie was asleep again, curled beneath the quilt someone else had once stitched. Her face was still pale, her hair still white, but she looked less like someone broken and more like someone beginning to rise. Tomas stepped back into the house just once, placed his wife's old comb on the bedside table, and left without a word. The mule brayed. The sky was turning lavender. And the woman he found buried in dust had made it through the night. The mornings came slower in the canyon. They peeled themselves from the rock like molasses in winter, thick, reluctant, amber-colored. Bessie sat near the small window, her hands curled around a tin cup of weak coffee, watching the light sift through the dust motes. She hadn't spoken much in 3 days. But she was upright now, no longer flinching at every creak of the floorboards, no longer expecting Robert's boots to appear in the doorway. Her white hair was clean, parted to one side and loosely braided. She'd found the old comb on the bedside table and used it without question, though her hands trembled as she did. Tomas moved like a man who didn't need words to fill silence. He chopped wood just beyond the threshold, shirt sleeves rolled up, dark braids swinging between his shoulder blades. The rhythm of the axe was steady, almost meditative. She listened to it the way some women listen to church bells. At night, he would hum low songs in a language she didn't understand. Not for her, necessarily, but he didn't stop when he knew she was listening. She wanted to ask who had sewn the quilt. Who had carved the faded bird into the wooden spoon she used. But she didn't yet know how to ask without sounding like a trespasser in someone else's grief. On the third evening, she tried. Was she young? He didn't stop stacking the logs. Same age as you. She nodded, staring at her reflection in the tin cup, eyes hollow, skin pale but healing. What happened to her? Fever, he said simply. 2 winters ago. Do you ever wish she'd lived? His hands paused. Then resumed. I wish the world were kinder. It was the kindest answer he could have given. That night, Tomas placed a bowl of stew between them at the table. 1 spoon. She raised her eyebrows. Don't like wasting water washing too, he said. She smiled. It surprised them both. After the meal, Bessie lingered at the hearth. Her gaze drifted to the row of dried herbs above the mantel: sage, yarrow, lavender. She reached for the bundle of yarrow, her fingers grazing the brittle stems. I used to grow this, she murmured. Tomas looked up. In my garden. Back when I thought I'd be a mother. She waited for him to turn away, to pretend he hadn't heard. Instead, he rose slowly, crossed the room, and stood beside her. Still might be, he said. Garden first. It was not a promise. Just a seed planted softly in the space between them. In town, the gossip had started. It began with a boy who had seen her near the market trail, cloaked but recognizable. Word spread quick as prairie fire. Bessie Callahan, the buried wife, alive. Living with an Apache. Hair white as snow, like a ghost come back wrong. Eunice Harrow heard it in the general store. She didn't believe it at first. But the way Robert flinched when she mentioned Bessie's name made her pause. She died of shame, he snapped. Ran into the canyon like a madwoman. Eunice watched him closely. She had known Robert when they were teenagers, proud, sharp-edged, charming when it served him. But now, she saw the rot just beneath his skin. She didn't bury herself, she said quietly. Robert's jaw clenched. Some women can't handle being replaced. Some men don't deserve replacements. She left before he could answer. By the next Sunday, the town whispered her name like a warning. Some claimed she was cursed, others said she was touched by spirits. A few pitied her. Fewer still believed her rescue was an act of grace. But no one confronted Robert. Men like him had too many friends in dusty rooms and too many secrets held by too many mouths. Back in the canyon, Bessie stood barefoot in the garden plot behind the cabin. The soil was poor but soft, shaded by cottonwood. She'd cleared away the rocks, set up rows, and marked them with bits of wood. Tomas had watched from a distance, then quietly brought her seeds wrapped in an old kerchief. You knew I'd need these, she asked. I hoped you'd want them. They planted together, his hands rough, hers careful. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. That night, as dusk fell and smoke curled from the chimney, she asked the question she'd feared would break everything. Do you want me to leave when I'm stronger? He didn't answer at first. Just stirred the fire, then sat beside her on the stoop. I don't want to bury another woman, he said. She turned her face to him. But I'm not dying. His eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. I know. That's why I want you here. She looked away then, breath caught in her throat. Not because she didn't believe him, but because she did. Inside, the fire crackled. Ashes floated like snow. They reminded her of her old parlor, the one she'd sat in while Robert told her she was fading. Useless. Hair like a witch. Womb like a broken bottle. But here, Tomas handed her firewood like it mattered. Here, her silence wasn't used against her. Here, she was allowed to heal without earning it. Later that night, she stood by the wash basin. Her reflection wavered in the lantern light. She studied her white hair, her pale skin, the new lines near her eyes. She touched her own face gently, then whispered, "You're not dead." In the canyon, even ashes told the truth. They didn't whisper lies. They cooled, they settled, but they stayed where they belonged, beneath the hearth of a house still standing. And Bessie, for the first time in years, began to believe she might stand too. The storm rolled in quietly, as if even the clouds were cautious of the canyon. The sky turned a dull pewter, then darkened further until the light was no longer golden but the color of spilled ink. Bessie stood at the edge of the garden she'd planted weeks ago, her bare toes in the soil, her hair down around her shoulders like threads of silver caught in wind. The air was heavy, wet with promise. She didn't flinch at the thunder. She didn't run for shelter when the first cold drops fell. She simply raised her face to the sky and let it come. Behind her, the cabin door creaked, but she didn't turn. Tomas stood in the threshold, one hand on the frame, watching her as the rain soaked through the thin cotton of her dress. It clung to her like a second skin, but she didn't care. She was used to the weight of things. She raised her arms slowly, elbows bent, palms facing upward. The same way one might surrender. Or pray. Let the town say what it would. Let Robert spit his name in bitterness and the church ladies clutch their crosses. Let the stories twist and tangle. She was still standing. He didn't call her inside. He only stepped out quietly, walked across the soft ground, and laid his shawl over her shoulders. Not to cover her, but to share the moment. The rain came harder. And she wept beneath it. Not from sorrow, but from the quiet grief of having survived. They stood like that until the storm passed. Until the sky burned clean again. Until she could breathe without tasting memory. Inside, she peeled off the wet clothes and changed into a dry calico dress. Her skin glowed with warmth from the fire Tomas had built. He handed her tea without a word, and she drank, the steam fogging her lashes. "I used to hate rain," she said. He looked up. "Why?" "Robert wouldn't let me come in until I apologized. Even if I hadn't done anything." Tomas nodded once, as if the answer was enough. As if he'd expected it. "I don't hate it anymore." In town, the rumors had reached fever pitch. Men spit tobacco and muttered about pride. Women said bless her heart and quickly followed it with, but she should have known better. One boy claimed to have seen Bessie walking barefoot through the canyon trail with an Apache at her side, hair loose, face calm. Eunice Harrow, sitting behind the post office desk, heard every word. She made no comment until Robert Callahan walked in, jaw tight, eyes bloodshot. "You heard?" he asked. She didn't blink. "I did. She's not right in the head." "She looks right enough to be living," Eunice replied. "That's more than I can say for the one who buried her." His face darkened. "Don't you start." She leaned forward across the counter, hands steady. "If you buried her and thought God would send you someone better, you're a fool. If she's still alive, then maybe Grace is." Robert left without buying what he came for. He mounted his horse and rode out of town with no coat, fury riding behind his eyes like a second shadow. Back in the canyon, Bessie was learning to smile again. Not the kind she'd worn at church socials. Not the kind she used when Robert's friends were visiting. But something smaller. Earned. Her smile came slowly, like spring after a hard freeze. When she laughed on the rare days she let herself, it startled her. She had begun to gather wildflowers and placed them in a rusted tin beside the bed. She made bread with Tomas's leftover cornmeal and hung linens over the line without being asked. She no longer asked permission before opening windows. One night, she found Tomas in the barn, fixing a broken latch on the chicken coop. He looked up at her, sweat on his brow. "I'm not your wife," she said, quiet but firm. "No. I don't owe you anything." He nodded. "I'm not a burden either." "I never thought you were." She exhaled. "Then what am I?" He stood slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. "You're someone who didn't deserve what happened. And someone who makes this place more like home." That night, she braided her hair by the fire. Not because it was tangled, but because it felt like claiming something back. The next morning, she woke to find a spool of blue thread and a folded piece of fabric on the table. A simple pattern sketched in charcoal, an apron, and a dress with wide sleeves. Tomas had never once spoken of her staying. But he had left her a future to choose. She sewed through the day, the cabin warm with the sound of her needle pushing through cloth. Outside, the chickens pecked, the beans stretched toward the sun, and the canyon walls whispered nothing but wind. In the evening, Tomas returned with 2 tin cups, one filled with blackberries. "For the garden," he said. She took them from him. Their fingers brushed. They held the touch longer than necessary. He turned to leave, but she stopped him with a question. Do you think the world can change? His eyes were tired. Honest. No. But I think you can. Bessie stood in the doorway long after he'd gone, eating berries one by one, letting the juice stain her fingertips. The sky was pale now, drained of storm. But somewhere deep in her chest, thunder still rumbled, not as fear, but as memory. She would never forget the burial. But now she was standing. And the sky, for once, did not weep alone. The canyon was still the morning Robert arrived. No bird called. No mule brayed. Even the wind, usually bold as a preacher on Sunday, held its tongue. Bessie was kneeling in the garden, palms in the dirt, humming something she hadn't sung since girlhood. A lullaby with no baby, a song her mother once sang while brushing her hair. The earth was warm under her knees. She just started seeing the first sprouts, green, delicate, stubborn as she was. Tomas was mending the fence along the west edge, shirt rolled to the elbows, hat low against the sun. He heard the hooves before she did. 4 of them. 2 riders. Then the 3rd. Then the 4th. He didn't move fast. He didn't panic. He simply wiped his hands on a cloth and walked toward the house. Bessie stood slowly, spine straightening with instinct. She knew that rhythm. The pace of the lead horse. The arrogance in its stride. Robert. She didn't ask Tomas to stop him. She didn't ask what to do. She brushed the dirt off her palms, smoothed her braid, and walked inside. She didn't hide. She didn't tremble. Robert dismounted with the grace of a man who thought the land owed him something. He was cleaner than he'd been, hair slicked, shirt new. But the stink of rot still lived behind his teeth. His eyes scanned the small cabin, then fixed on Tomas. "You've got something of mine," he said. Tomas didn't answer. Robert gestured to the men behind him, town boys, followers. Not killers, just cowards who like loud men and cheap whiskey. One clutched a rifle, badly. "Bessie," Robert called, loud enough to echo. "Come out." And she did. Not limping. Not crying. Just walking, as any woman might step out of her home to greet the morning. Her white hair was braided down her back, her dress plain, her chin lifted. Robert's eyes flickered. "Look at you," he sneered. "Living like a squaw in a mud hut." Tomas's hand twitched once, then stilled. Bessie raised a palm, not to him, but to herself. As if reminding her own body not to step backward into fear. "I'm not yours anymore, Robert. You're still my wife. You buried your wife." The air snapped quiet. The other men shifted. One spat into the dirt. The rifle boy looked suddenly very young. "I made a mistake," Robert said, voice tightening. "You were confused. Sick." "You tied my hands," she said calmly. "You packed the dirt yourself. You said it would humble me. But the truth is, you were ashamed of my hair. Ashamed I didn't give you a child. Ashamed that someone might think you'd married a woman with a soul." Robert stepped forward. Tomas did too. They met in the middle, eyes locked. One full of rusted pride. The other, of steady silence. "You don't scare me," Robert muttered. "I don't need to," Tomas said. "But you will leave." Robert laughed, short, bitter. "You going to make me?" Tomas didn't answer with fists. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn piece of paper. Quietly, he unfolded it and held it up. Robert squinted. It was a deed. Signed and stamped. Ownership of the land. Bessie's name written in black ink. "Sheriff saw it last week," Tomas said. "Filed it. This is her home." "She can't own land," Robert hissed. "She can when her husband is presumed dead." Robert's face turned the color of bruised plums. "You think this matters?" he barked. "You think a paper keeps you safe? You think this place, the Savage's shack, is a future?" "No," Bessie said, stepping forward now. I don't think. I know. She stopped within arm's length of him. His breath smelled like liquor and bitterness. You wanted to burn me, she said softly. You wanted me to wither. But the fire you left behind couldn't burn me twice. Robert raised a hand, barely. A twitch. And Tomas stepped between them. You swing once, he said low, you won't swing twice. The rifle boy dropped his gun. The others turned. Robert looked around, realizing for the first time he was alone. Not because no one stood behind him, but because no one would. Bessie stepped past him then, walking to the edge of the garden. She picked up the trowel she'd left behind, drove it gently into the soil, and said nothing more. Tomas waited until the hoofbeats faded down the trail. Then he walked back, knelt beside her, and helped plant a row of wild onion. No one spoke until sundown. That evening, Bessie lit the lamp herself. She boiled tea, added a touch of honey, and poured it into 2 cups. They drank on the porch, shoulder to shoulder, the silence no longer hollow but full of earned peace. You didn't have to stand between us, she said finally. I know, Tomas answered. I would have stood alone. I know. She reached for his hand then, not like a woman reaching for rescue, but like someone anchoring herself to the present. Later, as the fire burned low and the stars returned to their rightful place, Tomas turned to her and asked softly, What now? She leaned her head against his shoulder. We plant. He smiled. And the canyon breathed easier. The world would still whisper. Let it. Let the town invent its stories. Let the tongues wag and the church pews buzz. It didn't matter. She had survived the grave, the shame, the man who called himself husband. And in doing so, she'd become something else entirely. Not reborn. Just free. And freedom, once tasted, could not be buried again. So if you're watching this and you've been told your worth has an expiration date, if you've been made to feel like the seasons have passed you by, or your silver hair is a curse instead of a crown, remember this. The fire might scar you. But it will never name you.